Most of you out there watching this are familiar with the Arado 234. This was the first operational jet bomber, and when it began conducting missions against the Allies in August 1944, it proved a significant problem for British and American interceptors with its high speeds. Of course, the Allies had recognised as well that jet propulsion almost certainly represented the future of aviation, and they were busy creating their own jet fighters. The British actually had the Gloucester Meteor operational a month before the AR-234 got into service, while the Americans actually flew their first jet fighter, the admittedly experimental and pretty rubbish Bell P-59, as early as 1942. Which begs the question, where were the Allied jet bombers? After all, bombing was an absolute key strategy for the Western Allies, with vast amounts of money and technical knowledge being expended in developing better and more efficient aircraft for this role throughout the war. Well, in case you hadn't guessed, they were, or at least the Americans were. And had it not been for the atomic bomb, it is possible that one of these, the Douglas XB-43 Jetmaster, would have seen use, perhaps in 1946. The Jetmaster's origins date back to October 1943. In May of that year, Douglas had approached the United States Army Air Force, the USAAF, with a proposal to develop a new medium bomber which would have two piston engines in an innovative and unique configuration, mounting them internally behind the cockpit and driving twin contra-rotating props in a pusher setup at the back of the aircraft. The USAAF liked the idea enough that they ordered a development of this aircraft, designated the XB-42 Mixmaster, and that is a story for another time. But Douglas obviously decided that while they had the Air Force's attention, they would make another proposal, a development of the Mixmaster utilising two of the newfangled jet engines that everyone was getting excited about. Investigations into whether this was viable showed that it seemed to be, and in March 1944 Douglas was told to switch part of their authorization to develop the Mixmaster over to what was then classified as the XB-43, with two prototypes ordered. In fact, this was for two different aircraft, the first a bomber with a glazed nose and the capacity to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs, while the second would be an attack variant that would have a solid nose which housed 16 50 caliber heavy machine guns and a payload of 35 5-inch rockets. Douglas also planned to fit a remote controlled and radar directed turret in the tail which would house twin 50 caliber defensive guns, but this ultimately never happened. Propulsion was provided by two General Electric J-35 jet engines, which provided 3,750 pounds of thrust each and which took the place of the two piston engines of the Mixmaster. The change of power plant meant that modifications to the design were necessary, with two air inlets being added to the fuselage just behind the cockpit area and the large lower ventral fin needed by the Mixmaster being removed. Instead, the vertical stabilizer was increased in size to provide the necessary stability to the design. The cockpit layout was also rather unusual. Eschewing the normal practices, the two-man crew were housed in a rather odd double bubble, which saw the two-man crew each have their own canopy. Now, according to some sources, this was found to be awkward and later switched to a tandem setup, with both crew under a single-piece canopy. I'll admit I'm not so sure about that, because the only pictures I've found of the aircraft have the twin side-by-side canopy, and the remaining airframe appears to retain it as well. But if anyone has solid knowledge about this, please feel free to enlighten us all in the comments. As a sign that the USAAF were keen to get the new aircraft, they gave a provisional order for 50 of the new bombers should the prototype testing prove satisfactory. And Douglas, evidently confident, laid plans to produce 200 of the new bombers, which would have been the B-43 in service, a month. Yes, 200 a month. Douglas wanted their new aircraft to basically replace, well, most of the existing bomber types in service, certainly for mid-range missions. And that might not have been too bad a thing. The prototypes demonstrated a top speed of 515 miles per hour at sea level, while cruising speed was 420 miles per hour. With its maximum payload, the XB-43 was projected to have a range of 1,100 miles, which would have limited its operations, but its speed would likely have made it extremely difficult to intercept, especially for the standard piston engine aircraft operating late in the war by the Axis powers. I mean, yes, a service aircraft would have been heavier and almost certainly slower, but still not bad performance. And all in all, I would say the XB-43 was a pretty nice looking aircraft, if a little bit dumpy. But hey, it was a bomber/attack aircraft, what do you want? But as you no doubt have guessed, it was never to be. Though the USAAF may have been interested in the original proposal, the existing aircraft in service were adequate for requirements, and as development of both the Mixmaster and Jetmaster progressed, first Germany and then Japan surrendered. As said, but for the atomic bombing of Japan, it is possible the XB-43 may have seen some use, but with the US aero industry fully committed to what they were doing, there were delays in Douglas obtaining the jet engines for the two prototypes. In October 1945, the program had a significant setback when one of the engines shed some of its compressor blades during an engine run-up test. This led to the aircraft suffering a significant amount of damage, and so it wasn't until May 1946 that the XB-43 undertook its first flight. This was reported as satisfactory, though the Jetmaster was considered, I suppose somewhat ironically given its name, underpowered. One other problem encountered during the later flight testing was that the plexiglass nose cone broke, and the Douglas staff replaced it with a plywood one. That seems to have worked fine for the rest of the program. But as said, the war was over, and the pressure to get a medium jet bomber into service had cooled off considerably. Instead, the United States Army Air Force decided that, because of the limitations of the early jet engines, that they would prefer a four-engine design instead, and interest was now focused on the North American B-45 Tornado, a far more capable aircraft, certainly on paper at least, to the XB-43. But both Jetmasters were paid for, and so they were put into service as engine testbeds, with the second aircraft, technically the YB-43, joining its sibling in 1948. The aircraft were used in testing the next generation of jet engines in the shape of the General Electric J47 turbojet. And that engine would go on to power some extremely important military aircraft, most notably the F-86 Sabre and the FJ Fury fighters, as well as the B-47 strategic bomber. In 1951, the original prototype was damaged in a landing and subsequently used as a source of spares for the YB-43, which carried on flying until December 1953. That aircraft does actually still exist and was preserved first by the Smithsonian and then transferred to the National Museum of the United States Air Force, where it has been languishing in a warehouse somewhere for decades, awaiting the required funds to restore it so it can be fit for display purposes. As it has been in store for 70 odd years now, don't hold your breath on seeing it anytime soon. But you never know. Maybe one day.